Hello once again, and welcome to another edition of the SaskAgToday.com Roundtable. I'm joined by the Chief Agricultural Editor of SaskAgToday.com, Kevin Hirsch, as well as the Agri-News Director for 620 CKRM Regina, Ryan Young. I'm Doug Falconer, Agriculture Director at GX94 in Yorkton. And it's been a week, gentlemen, since all the news came down about layoffs and farm closures at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and also layoffs now at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. But there doesn't seem to be any shortage of reaction to it. And what do you think of all of that, Kevin?
Well, certainly all the major farm groups have reacted to the Ag Canada research cuts, and you'd expect them to. In most of the commodity group cases, Ag Canada is a partner in research with groups like SAS Wheat and SAS Oilseeds, all contributing money to various research programs. But I don't think that they're going to be able to turn back the clock on this. I don't think that the mainstream media or politicians will pay enough attention to this to actually change the mind of Ag Canada. And I think it's really unfortunate. Ag Canada has been losing staff and losing programs for years, and now this is a huge cut on top of that. The CFIA is much the same situation. Talk about a civil service that's ballooning and up 30% over the past number of years, but CFIA positions have not been increasing, and now they will also be the subject of major cuts. In most cases, farmers won't really see that difference at CFIA. That's more of a food safety thing. Farmers tend to interact with CFIA when there's something like avian influenza or bovine tuberculosis, and then they become far more involved with CFIA than they ever wanted to be, but they won't see it directly. And in the case of Ag Canada cuts, again, those are typically long-term research projects, and even crop breeding is a long-term prospect. So it's not something that they will see immediately. So even though the farm groups will continue to complain and lobby about it, I don't think that the grassroots producers in most cases will be raising it with their politicians in the same way that, for instance, they would have raised Chinese tariffs. So I don't think that these decisions are going to be rolled back.
Well, we heard late this week that the House of Commons Agriculture Committee wants to review it and is contemplating calling the Agriculture Minister, Heath MacDonald, to testify. Do you think that could have any impact at all?
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that, Doug. That's interesting that at least is going that route. But again, I would hope that we can get a little more sanity in the cuts and a little more clarity in what's being cut and what are the plans to mitigate the impact. But I still remain pessimistic that this is going to have much of an impact.
Of course, one of the interesting interviews Ryan did was with Sask Organics this week. I know that the organics research program in Swift Current, led by Dr. Miriam Fernandez, is on the chopping block, apparently. And Ryan, you had a chance to speak with a gentleman from Sask Organics who was quite concerned about that.
Yeah, I was talking with the president of Sask Organics, Will Odie, and a couple of things that really stood out in my chat with him. One was obviously the fact that they relied heavily, if not exclusively, on the research done at Ag Canada and specifically at the research farm in Swift Current in Fernandez's work. Considering that Sask Organics is a not-for-profit organization compared to the crop development commissions, where the crop development commissions, they're legislated by the Agri-Food Act that they can charge a mandatory but refundable levy to producers that they can use that money towards research. But Sask Organics, again, since they're a nonprofit organization, they cannot. So they have to raise funds themselves, and that's only enough to cover like the expenses and cost of having an executive director on staff that does a lot of the legwork. So that really stood out to me. And he said, you know, with this cuts at Ag Canada, with the research gone, it's completely gone. So not sure what they're going to do. Hopefully that, you know, this void that's created by Ag Canada can be filled by, say, the universities or the private sector. In fact, I reached out to the University of Saskatchewan to see if they're impacted by the cuts at Ag Canada, and if there's any opportunity to fill that void, and have yet to hear a response to this point.
Kevin, what about Sask Organics? Obviously, that southwest part of the province sees a lot of organic activity.
Yes, it is too bad. And it's kind of strange that that one program was singled out as a program we know will be cut. We know which stations are closing and which experimental farms are closing, but that's interesting that that one program is singled out, and we have heard details that it is gone. And Ryan is quite right. There, you know, the organic industry does not have a checkoff program to contribute to research. And maybe that's part of the reason why that program in particular was axed. But even conventional farmers should be concerned about this, because many of the principles for low input agriculture or organic agriculture are transferable to the people that are in the conventional stream of agriculture. So I view it as a loss to the entire industry, particularly though the organic industry.
Also, this week, we saw a white paper issued by a company, I guess by an organization, regarding residue in crops concerns by the European Union. That was something you followed up on, Kevin.
Yeah, they issued a white paper out of the Canada Grains Council. And Canada Grains Council encompasses most of the major farm groups. It encompasses ag industry as well, and do some very interesting work, particularly on maximum residue limits and how they can be a non-tariff trade barrier. And in Europe, their analysis is that over the past 10 years or so, Europe has lost about half of the products that they used to be able to use as far as crop protection, sometimes maybe for valid reasons, but many times for political reasons. And now the push by Europe is, well, if we can't use them, we shouldn't import products from countries that are still using those products. And that's the worry by Canada Grains Council, is that reciprocity issue could indeed limit where Europe will buy products from, and that this may spread to other countries. Maximum residue limits are not very well understood, particularly by the general public, that say there shouldn't be any residue ever. Well, you can now find almost anything anywhere when you start measuring in parts per billion, which is just such a tiny level. And that's why maximum residue limits are set at very safe levels, oftentimes with 100 times margin of safety. But countries are really all over the map as to whether they have their own MRL for a particular product, or whether they're going off the Codex, which is supposed to be the international standard. But if they don't have an MRL, many countries revert to zero or the level of detection, and that is the worry. Trying to get all the countries in agreement on MRLs has been a continuing effort of the Canada Grains Council, but it has become increasingly difficult in many cases, especially in Europe.
Also this week on Wednesday, the Bank of Canada held its interest rate steady at 2.25%. I thought you got some interesting comments from Adam Picallo on that, Ryan.
Yeah, absolutely. He was one of many experts that was expecting the Bank of Canada to keep its interest rate at 2.25%. This is the first rate decision of 2026. One of the things that Adam said that kind of stood out was unless something really, really drastic happens when it comes to the tariffs or any other geopolitical factors, the Bank of Canada is really going to keep things steady and stay the course and just kind of let things fall into place, so to speak. They've also had a number of kind of job numbers and other economic indicators like inflation rate, job numbers relatively falling within projections. In fact, the outlook for the Canadian economy and global economies hasn't changed much since the last monetary policy report, which was in October. So again, they're just staying the course, and they're also waiting to see how the CUSMA review will go this summer. That's going to be a major factor moving forward in the interest rate. And of course, it all depends on what the U.S. president is going to do on a day-to-day basis.
Kevin, of course, that Bank of Canada interest rate, will it have much of an impact on average farmers out there?
Well, it's good that interest rates aren't rising. All this macroeconomic stuff, though, kind of works together. And one of the things that's happening right now is a weakening American dollar, the price of gold skyrocketing, and by comparison, the Canadian dollar strengthening. And I haven't looked at it the last couple of days, but last I heard the Canadian dollar was something like 73.5, which was up a fair bit. Maybe you guys have that at your fingertips. But what that's doing is it's actually shaving some of the price off of crops that we export. As the Canadian dollar increases in value, that decreases the value of crops for export, because most of that export trade is off of the American dollar. So that is something to watch. All of this macroeconomic stuff is all linked together. The value of dollar, interest rates, borrowing costs, fiscal policy, all comes to play together.
And Ryan, when we were at Western Canadian Crop Production Show in Saskatoon, you had a chance to speak to a number of businesses there about the impact of the tariffs when they first came into effect last year. Obviously, what comes to mind is Bourgault and, of course, Kloss as well.
That's right. I interviewed representatives from those two companies as well as Redhead Equipment. It was just something that just came to mind while at Crop Production Show, just looking around, and then just tariffs coming to mind and thinking, well, how did these companies manage to get through to this point? So, excuse me, when kind of make a long story short here, starting with Kloss, there was some initial worry and concern about how they were going to address that, considering that they do business in the United States as well, and I believe they also do some business in Europe. So there was one particular story I remember quite vividly where the guy said he was down at the production facility in Nebraska, and when news came down of these tariffs, one of the other employees said, well, we got to move these combines that are here at the facility. There's 94 of them, and we have 2.5 weeks to bring them up to Canada to avoid the eating the tariff cost. And so there was a little bit of a scramble as to how to do that. They managed to get it done, but it was just that initial onset of chaos that just kind of brought a lot of worry. But over time, as the threats kind of came on again, off again, you could almost argue a case of a boy who cried wolf too much. Everybody started to adjust. And so it's just become a kind of a new reality in the marketplace, so to speak. And that was basically the summary of my interview with Bourgault Industries, where they just made it a part of their business and just kind of accepted the fact and have a number of plans in place. So there's that. And then the interesting part about Redhead Equipment was in particular the trucking and trailer division. I was speaking with the manager of that, and he said that they had little to no issues when it comes to tariffs, because in the beginning last year, they bought a lot more parts and product than they normally would. So there was an oversupply, but they were able to charge that to customers at pre-tariff rates. And that managed to carry them through quite a bit of the year, avoiding all of the costs associated with the tariffs. So that's kind of a rough summary of how these companies were able to get over this issue. So really fascinating to hear their perspectives.
Kevin, your thoughts on how these ag businesses were able to adjust on the fly, basically?
Well, it's difficult. It was a difficult time to know what tariffs being threatened were going to turn out to be real and which ones were going to fall by the wayside. And that's still the case. Coming out of the deal that our Prime Minister Mark Carney made with China regarding canola and pea tariffs and more access for Chinese electric vehicles, initially Donald Trump said, no, if Canada can get a deal with China, they should take it. And then after more thought, or somebody talked to him, or whatever, he came back and he said, oh, if you're going to sign a free trade deal with China, I'm going to put 100% tariff on you. And then we had to backtrack and say, no, this isn't a free trade deal. It's areas of specific trade interest and walking back some existing tariffs. And I suspect that tariff threat will go by the wayside, but it's become very difficult to know which tariffs and which tariff threats to take seriously. And in the beginning, when we were taking all of the tariff threats at face value, there was actually some companies made decisions that were the wrong decisions, cost them money to take a particular position in the marketplace for a tariff that didn't materialize. And it sort of harkens back to what Carlo Dade of international trade expert called weaponized uncertainty.
All right, and finally, it's getting closer and closer to spring and thoughts of turning to spring seeding. And Ryan, you had a chance to speak with Tice Massich from the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture about the need for crop reporters in the province.
Yeah, and right now they have a pretty healthy amount of crop reporters, about 225 scattered across the province. So they're pretty happy about where they're all located, but they could always use more. And in fact, there's quite a bit of RMs around the province that don't have one crop reporter. So they're looking to fill those gaps, mostly in the central areas of the province and southern parts of the province, particularly close to the U.S. border. Now, he said the work is easy. All you have to do is just sign up online. And then at some point in March, you get all the material that you'll need to report on various things during the seeding and harvest season, from rainfall amounts to growing conditions to percentage of areas seeded, etc., so on and so forth. There's about 5 to 8 questions that reporters have to fill in and then submit by the deadline on Wednesday, I believe at 9 a.m. specifically. But Tice said if you can't get any answers to some of those questions, you can just leave it blank. It's no issue. But the one thing that you do have to fill out, it's mandatory, is the rainfall totals. So you don't necessarily have to be a farmer either to be a crop reporter. You could be somebody within the ag industry, like an agrologist or somebody that works at FCC. Doesn't matter. If you have an interest in reporting on local conditions around you, make sure to sign up with the Ministry of Ag to be a crop reporter.
Kevin, a lot of value in crop reporters, isn't there?
I don't know what we do without that weekly crop report. We come to rely on it for really good information about what's happening across the province. And kudos to the people, and many of them long-time crop reporters for their area. And it's heartening to know that you don't have to, as a crop reporter, answer every question every week. Yes, they want the rainfall data, but for instance, some of the information on how are crops grading in your area, man, if you're not growing that specific crop or haven't had contact with anybody talking about that, how are you really going to know that answer? So good to know that you don't have to make things up for what you might not have expertise in. But again, we really owe a debt of gratitude to the volunteer crop reporters that, and the crop report is looked at within Saskatchewan, it's looked at nationally, it's looked at internationally, and provides really good information for the entire sector.
All right, well, that'll do it for this week's edition of the SaskAgToday.com Roundtable. On behalf of 620 CKRM Regina Agri-News Director Ryan Young and the Chief Agricultural Editor for SaskAgToday.com, Kevin Hirsch, I'm GX94 Yorkton Agriculture Director Doug Falconer saying so long until next time.